Abigail, I'm going to share my screen to just show the house rules. I think I can do that while yours are still on, but for 2 minutes, I'll put my slides on.
Are you back? Yes, you're back. Okay.
Yeah, so I was saying I'm just going to share my screen just to show the house rules, and then we can come back to your screens in another minute. All right, so it's 4:02, let's start. Hello and welcome again to the Applied Development Economics Seminar Series hosted by the Center for Research in Economics and Business, the Lahore School of Economics in collaboration with IGC Pakistan and CDPR. Today we are very happy to have Professor Abigail Barr with us, who is going to be presenting very interesting work on normative disagreement among spouses and the role that plays in the efficiency of household decision making. Dr. Barr is a professor in economics at the University of Nottingham. Her research focuses on the role of other regarding preferences, for instance, how people set up mutually beneficial agreements and how they hold each other accountable to such agreements, to citizens' willingness and ability to hold public service providers to account, and factors that can determine individual preferences and values. She has designed and implemented experiments in a number of different countries. For example, she's worked with students and villagers in countries such as Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Zimbabwe, Colombia, and with workers and unemployed people in UK, South Africa, with health workers and teachers in Ethiopia, Uganda, amongst, I mean, I'm skipping over some countries, but amongst many other countries. So Professor Barr, we welcome you to the ADE and we look forward to your talk. I also want to welcome your co-author, Floyd, who's joining us today. Again, we look forward to what you have to say today. Before we proceed to the presentation, let me just summarize some house rules for the audience. So Abigail will have about 40 minutes for her presentation. If you have any questions while she is presenting, please post them in the Q&A function in Zoom. We will try to stop periodically to answer any clarification questions. We will also have a 15-minute Q&A session at the end. In the session, you can continue to post questions in the Q&A, or you can also use the raise hand function, and we will then unmute you and you can ask your question live. And with this, I'll request Abigail to start her presentation. I'll just stop my slides, and whenever you're ready.
Okay, so I have to hello everybody, let me just set up again. There we go. I hope that's right. Okay, does everybody see the first slide? Okay, right, so we're good to go. So this is joint work with Marlene Decker, who's at the African Studies Centre in Leiden, with Floyd, who's with us today. He's the Director of Research at Financial Sector Deepening Zambia, who do a lot of advocacy work and think tank work aiming to improve access to financial services for not least of all the poor and women, but also in general to people in Zambia. And then Linda Zuze is a consultant working for FSD Zambia as well. So the work I'm going to present to you today is, oops, hang on. I can't advance my slides, that is a problem. Oh, there we go, okay. It's motivated by a number of findings documented in the literature. So first of all, throughout the developing world, we know that spouses are willing to sacrifice household efficiency in order to maintain individual control over money. We also know that wives in particular, but not only wives, take advantage of opportunities to hide money from their husbands and neighbours when they can do so, a way of maintaining control. In many places, even after controlling for education, household wealth and occupation, women are less likely than men to use formal financial services. And here I'm citing a report covering over 50 countries, I think, by somebody at the World Bank. And interventions designed to economically empower women by giving them access to financial services have, on a small but growing number of documented occasions, led to backlashes against those women. So all of these findings are consistent with the existence of either gender-specific social norms or disagreements in personal normative beliefs between husbands and wives relating to who should hold, manage and use money within the household. So just some definitions here. So the social norms and the personal normative beliefs, these are shoulds and oughts that guide individuals' decision making. They're the things they hold in their head. I should do this, I ought to do this. Now, the social norms, and here specifically we're thinking about so-called injunctive norms, are collectively held and acknowledged behavioural prescriptions. And it's often the case that violators of social norms are punished by other members of their social group. So personal normative beliefs, on the other hand, are individually held behavioural prescriptions. For self, I should do this, possibly for others, they should do that. They're linked to notions of identity, and I'm proposing that discord can arise between individuals who hold different normative beliefs. If I think I should do that, but another person thinks I should do something else, we're going to have a problem, we're going to fall out. Gender-specific is the next thing I just want to focus on quickly. So by gender-specific social norms, first of all, this is referencing the possibility that the prescriptions for what women should do may vary from the prescriptions from what men should do, but also the possibility that what women think women should do could differ from what men think women should do, and vice versa. So just to finish the motivation, if gender-specific social norms and or disagreements in personal normative beliefs exist and play a significant role in determining the choice of spouses with regard to compromising household efficiency, we need to factor this into intervention and financial product design. And that's why we're embarking on this investigation. So here are our research questions. First of all, are spouses in Zambia willing to compromise household efficiency in order to maintain individual control over resources? So in other words, can we replicate the finding that people have generated in many countries across the world in Zambia? The next question is, when spouses, and especially wives, can compromise household efficiency in order to maintain individual control, without their spouses knowing what they're up to, do they compromise it more? Okay, in other words, is information asymmetry playing a role here? Then we move on to our more novel questions. So do the decisions made by spouses in this regard relate to the social norms they acknowledge, their personal normative beliefs, and to differences between themselves and their spouses in terms of the social norms they acknowledge and or the personal normative beliefs that they hold. So our research design. At the heart of our research design was something called the Allocation Task. So I ought to have said right from the start, this is a lab in the field study. We're inviting people to play games for money. We're incentivizing the games in order to elicit incentive compatible measures of not so much their preferences, of their behavioral tendencies, I'm going to call them here. So at the heart is the allocation task, and this is based on Almas and co-authors' willingness to pay to control a sum of money task. So this task, at the time when we conducted our experiments, we believed we were the first to develop an adaptation of Almas's task, but it turns out that at least in 2 other studies, both RCT focused, adaptations of this task have been used as well. So one way of thinking of what I'm going to present to you now is that we're putting this task through its lab behavioral, we're exploring in depth what happens in this task, whereas others tend to have used a variant of the task to create a measure that they then go on to use in other types of analysis. So the task involves husbands and wives playing together as a pair. One is an active decision maker, the other is passive. There's no communication allowed between the spouses once they start the task. Okay, the decision maker is invited to make a series of 11 decisions. Each decision is about whether they or their spouse should receive a sum of money. So it's an either or decision. Each decision, each of these 11 decisions, has a 1 in 12 chance of determining the actual payoffs, the decision maker and their spouse. And there is a 1 in 12 chance that neither of them will receive any money. And I'll explain why that is important in a minute. So, for each of the 11 decisions, the decision maker is given a voucher in the form of a yellow sticker. And they're invited to decide which of two bowls, actually images on a page in a booklet, they're going to put their sticker in. If they put the sticker in the red bowl, they get the amount of money on the tab above the red bowl for themselves. So the red bowl is their own bowl. If they put the sticker in the blue bowl, then their spouse gets the amount of money on the tab above the blue bowl. So that's decision 1, 45 kwacha, about $5 for themselves or for their spouse. Then the next decision, we reduce the value of the voucher in their own bowl by 5 kwacha. Next decision, it goes down again and down and down and down until the 10th decision, they're deciding between nothing for themselves versus 45 kwacha for their spouse. Okay, and then the 11th decision, the voucher's worth 45 kwacha in their own bowl, but only 40 kwacha in their spouse's bowl. Okay, so half of the time in the couple, it was the husband who was the decision maker, and that was randomly determined. Half of the time, it was the wife who was the decision maker. Now, among the wives, half of them were told that after they'd made their decisions, their husbands would be told what those decisions were. So they had zero deniability, okay? Half the time, they were told their husbands would not know what their decisions were. And this, of course, is why there's a 1 in 12 chance that both spouses get zero is important, because it means a decision maker, if their spouse has received zero from the task, can say, well, that was because of the die roll, not because of my decision. Okay, so the same applies to the husbands. They also were randomly assigned to either the zero or the high deniability treatment. So that's the allocation task. And now I'm going to move on to the measuring personal normative beliefs and social norms part of the design. So for this, participants were engaged in 3 evaluation tasks designed to measure the personal normative beliefs and identify social norms, if indeed they existed. I'm only going to talk about the first of these 3 tasks today, and this first task focused on the appropriateness of the various behavioral options that the spouses had in the allocation task, the task I've just described to you. So the decision-making spouses were reminded of their first decision. Do you want 45 kwacha for yourself or 45 kwacha for your spouse? And the passive spouses were introduced to this decision. And then they were each asked, imagine a wife facing this decision. Suppose that she chooses to put the voucher in her own bowl, i.e. give herself 45 kwacha. Do you think this is very appropriate, somewhat inappropriate, very inappropriate? And then the next question was, what if she puts it in her husband's bowl? i.e. she chooses to give her husband 45 kwacha and have nothing for herself. Is this very appropriate, somewhat inappropriate, very inappropriate? And then they go through the same set of questions, but they're imagining a husband facing this decision. So there's 4 questions. Okay, so then the decision-making spouses went through a similar set of 4 questions, but focusing on the 35 kwacha for self or 45 kwacha for the spouse decision. In other words, the decision where choosing to have the money oneself rather than give it to one's spouse is at a cost of 10 kwacha. Okay, the passive spouses, we didn't go through this decision, partly because things were taking a long time and partly because we wanted them to be doing other types of evaluative tasks. Okay, so having answered those 8 questions for the decision-making spouse is just 4 for the passive spouses. We then said, we're going to ask you those questions again, but this time, if your response to one of the questions matches the modal response for that question, you may receive 30 kwacha. Of course, we use slightly different words there, but essentially what we're doing second time around is we're applying CREB-Weber's method for identifying social norms. And the idea here is that the participants are incentivized to coordinate. They're no longer simply expressing their opinion. They're going to get 30 kwacha, a significant amount of money, if their response matches the modal response in their session. Okay. And the idea is that if there's a social norm that should be guiding behavior in this context, then that is going to help them coordinate. They can get their 30 kwacha if all of them reference the social norm when they're giving their response. And this has been used in all sorts of different ways, not only by CREB and Weber, the original designers of the task, but by many others. And it seems to work very well at identifying what the norm is, what the collectively held opinion about what people should do in a decision-making task, what that is. Okay, so finally, our participants. I should also say that there was a survey. I'm not going to talk very much about that this time. Okay, so our participants were, we drew our participants from the Chewa and the Ngoni tribes in eastern province of Zambia. The Chewa are matrilineal, the Ngoni are patrilineal. I'm not going to talk too much about the behavioural differences between those two today. There are behavioural differences, but they're actually quite subtle. Okay. The important thing about these two ethnic groups is that they have very similar livelihoods. They're small scale, partially cash crop farmers. Okay. Okay. So our participants. In each of 22 villages across those two areas, we worked with 16 married couples. So 352 married couples in total. One of those couples turned out to be a fraud, and so they were eliminated from the data set, and one wife had to leave the workshop early. Okay, so we have just a few missing values in our data set. Here are some of the characteristics of the husbands and wives drawn from the survey that I'm not going to talk about very much. So the wives are younger, they're less educated, and that's all I'm going to say. So in a village on a day, first of all, one of the spouses from each of the 16 couples was allocated to either the zero deniability treatment allocation task session or the high deniability treatment allocation task session, and there was a gender balance across those sessions. Okay, their spouses, the passive spouses, were allocated to one of two evaluation task sessions, and those were single gender. So the women, when we got to the CREB version of the evaluation tasks, were trying to match their response to the responses of the other women in their session of 8, and the men were trying to match to the responses of the other men in their session. And this, of course, is important for identifying the gender specificity of the social norms. Okay, so these two evaluation task sessions, their first task was to focus on this, what should a wife do in this 45 to self versus 45 to spouse, and then what should a husband do? Okay, so now, the people in the allocation task, once they finished that task, they were remixed again into gender homogeneous sessions in order to do the evaluation task. Okay, and those sessions, they did not only the 45 to self versus 45 to spouse, but also 35 to self versus 45 to spouse evaluation. Now, this means, so first of all, notice that the women in the top left session are married to the men in the bottom right session, and the women in the top, the men in the bottom left session were married to the women in the top right session. And they were all evaluating this 45 to self versus 45 to other. So here we have not only the evaluations of the decision makers, but also the evaluation of their respective spouses about what should be done in these tasks. And this is going to allow us to answer that final question, is whether disagreements in personal normative beliefs between husbands and wives impact on decision making. So let's start with our first question, and I have to speed up. So, allocation task decisions. Now, if there is no compromising of household efficiency, then this is what our graphs would look like, okay? We're agnostic about who they allocate to in the 45 to self versus 45 to other decision, but when it's costly to allocate to themselves, we expect them not to do it, and when it's costly to allocate to their spouse, we expect them to allocate to themselves. Here is our data, okay? I'm showing you a separate plot here for the high deniability and the zero deniability treatments. In both treatments, we're seeing a lot of compromising of household efficiency. So focusing on the 40 versus 45 decision down to the 0 versus 45 decision, there's a lot of allocating to self, even though that's costly. Okay, so yeah.
Ask clarification questions, or should I wait?
Yeah, let's go for some clarification questions, although I'm going to run out of time at this rate. Should I stop sharing?
No, that's fine. So Sonia Balkar had asked, I think you've already answered this, but how exactly are you discriminating between personal normative and social norms? I think you just explained that. But a follow-up question on that was, in what order are these two questions asked? For example, is there any fear of anchoring when you ask always the social norms question afterwards?
We always ask the social norm question afterwards. There are concerns about anchoring, but given how we're using the data, we're not worried about those concerns. That said, I'll come back to that if I have a chance, actually. Yeah.
All right. So just one last question from Mehreen Mahmood. She's asking what was the rationale for 0 for herself versus 45 to partner choice? Does this capture willingness to control resources or something else about the relationship? And then you can start here.
It is obviously an extreme situation. But you know, once you start constructing the strategy space, it seems strange not to include it. I think it is worth noting that some spouses were willing to take nothing for themselves rather than 45 kwacha for their spouses. We were surprised by this. This seems like a very extreme behavior, but interviews with a significant proportion of those people, it was because their spouse, and this applies both to husbands and wives, was a drunk. And they actually would prefer nobody to have money than for their spouse to have money, because it would lead to violence. So, yes, right, I'm going to carry on now. Okay, next question. So here we're looking at the difference between the high deniability and the zero deniability in order to answer the second question. When we pull the data across husbands and wives, we see no difference. There's really no discernible difference when we look at these graphs. However, when we separate the husband's decisions from the wife's decisions, we see a clear space between the wife's strategy in the high deniability treatment and the zero deniability treatment. When their decisions are hidden and when they can keep the money hidden, they're more likely to allocate to self. And that shows through in our econometric analysis, which I'm not going to. So basically what you see in the graph is significant according to the econometrics. So wives do take advantage of information asymmetries, husbands don't. So now I'm going to move on to the third question. There's a lot to do here. So first of all, I'm going to show you the data. So here's the data, this evaluative data relating to the personal normative beliefs and the social norms. I'm going to show you a lot of graphs like this. So these are the husband's individual evaluations. So there's no incentive to coordinate on a response here. Each of these 4 columns in this panel relates to one of those questions. So the 2 on the left, it's when a wife is making the decision. On the far left, she's allocating to 45 to herself. Next, she's allocating 45 to her spouse. Okay, so that's a decision choice set pair. And then on the right of the figure, this is a husband allocating, and again, first of all to himself versus to the spouse. Okay, and then now I'm showing you also the wives' individual evaluations. The panel is organized in the same way. So first of all, looking at the husbands, notice, something else I should say. So that the green part of each bar shows you the proportion who said this is very appropriate. The yellow part shows you the proportion who said this is somewhat appropriate. The orange part, somewhat inappropriate. The red part, very inappropriate. So notice that across the board, the husbands are tending to say, oh, this is very appropriate. And this is to do with a social norm across the whole of Zambia, I'm inclined to say, of just being agreeable and nice. Okay, we're also, for the husbands, not seeing very much differentiation across the pairs. So it's a little bit less appropriate, it would seem, for a wife to allocate to her spouse rather than keep the money for herself. But compare that to what the wives think. The wives are much more opinionated, especially about what wives should do. They're indicating that it's, most of them think it's very appropriate for a wife to allocate to herself. And considerably fewer think it's appropriate for her to allocate to her spouse. Okay, now these 2 panels at the bottom of the slide, these are the same evaluations second time around when the incentive to coordinate is in place. So the first thing to note is there's still not that much agreement. Still across each of the responses, we're seeing a lot of variation across our sample. Okay, and this begs the question, is there actually a social norm that people are referencing when they're doing these evaluations? Okay, now currently hypotheses of the type a social norm pertaining to decisions in such and such a context exists versus does not exist. However, there are various features of our data that suggest that there isn't a social norm that people are referencing here. Okay, so first of all, where there's considerable agreement in the individual evaluations, the top part of the slide, introducing the CREB incentives reduces that level of agreement. So focus on the wives' evaluations that you can still see in the slide here. And look at this evaluation of a wife allocating 45 to herself rather than her spouse. We see much more agreement on this being very appropriate when the incentive isn't in place compared to when it is in place. This is inconsistent with them knowing that the norm is that wives should allocate to themselves. Okay, now what I'm showing you here is what's happening at the aggregate level, but if we look at the session by session level, we see this same reduction in the level of agreement when the incentive to coordinate is put in place. So also, if we do a tally, so there were 528 Krupke-Weber incentivized evaluations going on here across our 22 sessions. In only 6 of these was there complete agreement, okay? In only 54 more was there partial coordination, which I think I defined as over half of them agreed on a particular response, okay? This is a very low level of coordination given that it was incentivized. And then one more thing is important to point out. We asked the participants, you know, was it that 30 kwacha just wasn't enough to pull you away from your personal normative beliefs and focus on what other people were likely to say? And they said, no, 30 kwacha was plenty. We were very excited by the prospect of getting 30 kwacha. The problem was that they couldn't imagine what other people's evaluations were going to be. Now, given our definition of a social norm, these findings strongly suggest that there just wasn't some rule that they all acknowledged and knew about that was relevant to this decision-making context. So we conclude from this that there isn't, well, what I just said, there isn't a social norm guiding behavior here, okay? So from now on, I'm going to concentrate on personal normative beliefs, okay? All right, so just before I move on, I've shown you the data for the evaluations of 45 to self versus 45 to spouse. Here are the evaluations when the decision was 35 to self versus 45 to spouse, okay? We're no longer going to worry about with the incentive to coordinate in place. We're going to focus on the individual evaluations without an incentive. Okay, now I'm going to define a variable that I'm going to use in the analysis going forward. So this variable is the relative appropriateness of allocating to self within a particular decision-making scenario. So that might be the wife's making the decision or the husband's making the decision. Okay, so for each individual evaluator, we're going to define this as the appropriateness of allocating to self minus the appropriateness of allocating to spouse. Okay, so it's the difference across the two options. In order to do this subtraction, we have to put values on these appropriateness evaluations. And what we're doing following the literature is, if they say it's very appropriate, we give it an appropriateness rating of 1. Very inappropriateness is given an appropriateness rating of -1, and then somewhat appropriate 0.33, somewhat inappropriate -0.33. Okay, so then for each evaluator, for each scenario, we have the relative appropriateness of allocating to self versus allocating to spouse. And so now we can graph these and start to do comparisons that are much more directly informative. So focusing on the 45 to self versus 45 to spouse allocations, here are the husband's average relative appropriateness of allocating to self. So again, we see them being rather indecisive on average, or indifferent, if you like, on average. And this is irrespective of whether they're evaluating husbands making this decision or wives, okay? In the case of wives, at a 10% significance level, we do get a positive relative evaluation of allocating to self, but it's very weak. Okay. Wives, on the other hand, much more opinionated. When they're evaluating husbands, their relative evaluation, the relative appropriateness of allocating to self is weakly negative. When it's a wife making this decision, allocating to self is strongly positively appropriate. So now, this is the only time you're going to see them. If we now move to the decision where allocating to self is inefficient, we see a decline in the appropriateness of allocating to self across the board. And it's, on average, relatively inappropriate, except when the wives are thinking about a wife making this decision, and then they're indifferent. So that's the last you're going to see of that data. We're now going to focus on the evaluation of the 45 to self versus 45 to spouse evaluations. And the reason we're doing this is that for each decision maker, they have their own evaluations and also the evaluations made by their spouses. So here I'm showing you the decision-making spouses evaluations on the left and the passive spouses evaluations on the right. There is a significant difference here. In particular, the passive spouses are even more opinionated. Particularly the passive wives are even more opinionated about husbands should be handing the money over to their wives and wives should be keeping the money for themselves. Okay, we actually expected the opposite, a type of self-serving bias on the part of decision-making spouses. But that's not the case. It was the passive ones who were expressed far stronger opinions. And we just need to bear this in mind when we move on with the analysis. So now we're going to introduce some of that data into the analysis of allocation task decisions. Specifically, this is the model that I showed you very quickly before. Okay, so it's a linear probability model. The dependent variable is equal to 1 if an individual allocated to self in a particular one of the 11 decisions. And this is the first model, basically showing that the wives, in the high deniability treatment, the wives were more likely to allocate to self compared to the husbands after controlling for the other relevant factors. So the second model I'm going to show you, we introduce 2 new variables: own relative evaluation of to self and spouses minus own relative evaluation of allocating to self. I want to define these variables before I introduce them into the regression. So the own relative evaluation of to self for a wife making allocation task decisions was her relative evaluation of a wife allocating to self rather than giving the money to her spouse. And then for a husband making the allocation task decisions, we took their relative evaluation of a husband allocating to self rather than giving the money to their wife. Okay. Now, here is a histogram of what those self-relevant own relative evaluations look like. So the modal self-relevant own relative evaluation of allocating to self is a little bit greater than 0. So on the whole, the decision makers thought it was a little bit more appropriate to allocate to self rather than to their spouse. Okay, but we have a nice amount of variation in order to support our regression analysis. So now moving on to this next variable. So what we do here is, if the decision maker in the allocation task is a wife, we look at their husband's evaluation, relative evaluation of a wife allocating to self rather than giving the money to her husband. And then from that, we subtract the own relative evaluation of to self. So this is the level of disagreement. It's how much more appropriate your spouse thinks it is for you to allocate to self than you yourself think. Okay, and if that's negative, it means that the spouse thinks it's less appropriate for you to allocate to yourself than you yourself think it is. Okay, I told you it got complicated. Okay, so and here's the distribution of those differences. So the mode is at 0, agreement between the spouses, but we have, I think, slightly more than half of the sample. The spouse thinks it's less appropriate for the decision maker to allocate to self than the decision maker themselves thinks it is for them to allocate to self. But again, we have nice variation in order to support our regression analysis. And this is what happens when we introduce those two new variables into our model. So first of all, as you would expect, the more relatively appropriate, let's focus on the wives, a wife thinks it is for wives to allocate to themselves, the more likely she is to do that. Similarly for husbands. And I should say here that when we do a child test to see if we can pull across the genders here, we can, okay? After factoring in this, the differential treatment effect across the genders. Okay, moving on to this level of disagreement between the spouses. In the zero deniability treatment, the level of disagreement kicks in. It has a significant effect. So what this is telling us is if, let's focus on a wife. If a wife knows that her husband thinks it's less appropriate for her to allocate to herself than she herself thinks it is, then she factors that in. She compromises. She moves towards what her husband thinks is appropriate. In the high deniability treatment, when we have information asymmetry, the husband is never going to know what the wife is doing. We don't see such an effect. There is no compromising. Okay, which is what we would expect, and actually really very satisfactory result. The other thing I think is that it's important to bear in mind here is we could only pick up these effects of disagreement if the decision-making spouses could form some sense of what would my husband or wife think I ought to do in this task when they're engaging in the task, okay? Which suggests that even though the task is really quite abstract, they're able to reference something about their everyday lives in order to inform not only their own decisions, but also what their husbands or wives would think about those decisions. Anyway, so we have our answers to our final two question parts here. So, yes, their personal normative beliefs do inform their decisions, and yes, differences between themselves and their spouses in terms of personal normative beliefs also inform their decisions. And there are conclusions, and remarkably, I have come in on time. Yeah, and I'm going to leave it there. There's something else, if we have time, that I'd quite like to discuss, but I'll leave that for now.
Well, I can maybe take a few questions, and we do have, I think, 2-3 minutes if you want to get into that. It's up to you.
Well, let's take some questions, because the last thing I want to present is sort of a bit of a left turn, if you know what I mean. It's a slightly different take on everything that's going on here. So I'll take some questions first.
Thea, I've just unmuted you if you can ask your question if you're still here.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I actually had a question about the norm elicitation, and I was wondering whether you use a non-participating sample to get to the social norm. So subjects who are not participating in the experiment but are asked what would be the appropriateness scale.
No, we haven't done that yet, and I can understand where you're coming from with that. I think that would be a very interesting thing to do. So the closest we get to the non-participants are the passive spouses, but of course they are stakeholders in the task. So no, I do think that would be an interesting thing to do, but we didn't do it.
I see, thanks.
Marcela?
Hi. So I'm wondering about the discussion on the social norm. So you're arguing that there is no social norm. I'm thinking, could it be that the social norm is more complex than that? So whether the resources should be kept on the hands of women or not could be conditional on her own circumstances. So maybe the reason why you don't find this consistent behavior or this unique response on the mode response is that people think that others are in the same circumstances that they are themselves. So if I am an unemployed woman, I would think that I should keep the resources for myself, and that is acceptable. And therefore, I think that everybody should be responding in the same way.
Okay, so yeah, so before I respond to that, I think it's important to bear in mind, we didn't imagine that these villagers had kind of pre-formed norms about what people should do in the allocation task. Okay, this is about whether there is something in the lexicon of norms that exists, that is collectively held in their communities that they can reference when trying to coordinate. When it comes to evaluating decisions made in the allocation task. I'm also going to say that we evaluated other things. So, for example, there was a part of the evaluation task that was all about keeping secrets about money from your spouses. And there we saw a very strong norm against keeping secrets, okay, across the board. So that tells us that it wasn't that people didn't understand about the value of coordinating in the tasks I showed you. It was just they couldn't coordinate because they couldn't reference anything, a norm that would help them with the coordination. Now, I think it's possible that the norms are more complex in the way you describe. And I think that is something that would be well worth exploring, okay? But it doesn't change the fact that we find no evidence in our data that there was a commonly held social norm, either commonly held by all of our subjects or just one gender subsample of our subjects, or indeed subjects within each of the communities we worked that could help them coordinate. Yeah, so there wasn't a collectively held view on how people should behave that could be referenced when thinking about this task among our subjects.
Right. Yeah, so it's just more that there is also heterogeneity in the circumstances, and this heterogeneity in the circumstances could be affecting the response. But I think this is something that you could explore further. Thank you.
Okay, Kate Viberny, if you can please ask your question.
Yeah, no, it was more of a small follow-up on Marcela's point. So first, I just wanted to say I think it's a really cool study, and secondly, I really like the fact that you all asked the respondents why they felt they couldn't coordinate, because I think that qualitative sort of observation does a lot for making it believable that that what was happening there was that they couldn't imagine what the other people were thinking. That I really like that a lot. But yeah, just building on Marcela's point, that I was wondering if there, for example, if there's rule that says that, like, if the norm is you should split everything 50-50 and that's not an option in the game, then people might have a hard time figuring out what to do, because the choice that would be normative is not in the choice set. But I think you've already responded to the larger point here, so feel free to move forward if there are other points that people want to add.
No, I'm going to respond referencing Anandi Mani's work on this topic. So her paper, where I think a 50-50 distribution is possible. She uses a different, really more complex task in her analysis. It's just come out in the World Bank review. And she's actually had quite a big rethink about the data. So if you're familiar with the paper in working paper form, I strongly recommend you read the now journal published form. In that, she argues convincingly that her data is consistent with the norm that states that the wife should not end up or earn more than the husband. So there's and what she finds specifically to support that is the husbands behave very spitefully if the allocation is less than 50% of the pie to them. Now, so Kate, you pointed out that we don't offer 50-50. In fact, we're only offering very extreme, either you get the money or they get the money. But it could be that if there is a norm, and Mani doesn't actually directly investigate whether the norm exists, it's just her data is consistent with the existence of this, the man should always end up with more than the wife. That norm could be impacting decisions here. It's just we don't know that for sure because we didn't set out to measure it. But I do think that would be well worth further investigation. Yeah. Okay, so very indirect response to you, Kate, sorry.
Thanks, Abigail. So there's one question on whether you saw any heterogeneity based on who controls resources at home. So if you have any survey questions on that and if you see any heterogeneity.
We haven't got there yet. So we asked quite a classic set of who makes decisions about this, who makes decisions about that during the survey. And our responses to that set of questions appear to be quite consistent with the sort of responses that other people have got in sub-Saharan Africa, and actually not that different to responses that have been received in lots of developing countries. So majority saying, oh, we decide that together, and then there being a bias towards the husband deciding across certain domains. What we haven't done yet is look at whether and how that relates to decisions made in the allocation task, but it's something we intend to do. It's worth pointing out that Almas et al., with their willingness to pay task, they actually find it correlates in the wrong direction with an index based on responses to those sort of questions. And then I think Fiala does something similar and finds a correlation in the direction that you'd expect. So yeah, the jury is out about whether and how what people do in these allocation tasks relates to other measures of empowerment. Yeah.
Okay, so I think Naila Tasneem has a related question. Naila, you're unmuted. If you can ask your question, please.
I had a question about coordination between husband and wife. I'm sorry, I couldn't access the whole presentation, but I would like to know that is there a way of ascertaining how coordination between husband and wife can impact household decision-making efficiency, and if that happens, do social norms remain relevant or decisive in determining decision-making in a household? Thank you.
I think that's a very interesting question. It's not one that we're directly addressing anywhere in this design. Okay, so the coordination that we're inviting within the context of this design is specifically not between husbands and wives. It's among wives or among husbands within a particular community. And the husband-wife decision making here, it's either the wife or the husband making a decision. Okay, I think the indirect referencing of coordination between husbands.
Just to clarify, it's not about coordination within a household. It's about coordination between a set of husbands and wives within a community. Is that what we're talking about?
That is what we're inviting in one part of our research design. We're inviting wives to try and coordinate with each other by referencing a social norm in order to respond to an allocation, in order to respond in an evaluation task. It's a way of trying to get at, is there a social norm? And if there is, what is that social norm? A collectively held behavioral rule. Okay.
Okay.
But that's not the research question. The research question is about hiding behavior and efficiency compromising behavior on the part of husbands and wives. Okay, so in terms of what our results say about coordination between husbands and wives in everyday life, what we've got is evidence that when husbands and wives disagree about what each of them ought to be doing with resources, each of them is more inclined to compromise household efficiency when they can. In other words, focus on a wife. If a wife knows that what she thinks she ought to do with a resource is different from what her husband thinks she ought to do, then when there's information asymmetry, when she can act in secret, she's going to do what she thinks she ought to do. But when she knows her husband's going to find out about her actions, she'll compromise. She'll do something that is somewhere between what she thinks she ought to do and what her husband thinks she ought to do. So the presence of information asymmetries reduces compromising by spouses. Okay, and so arguably it reduces the extent to which they coordinate their actions, referencing the wishes of each of them and both of them. Yeah, does that help?
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah, so we have an anonymous question, which is basically asking you to comment on external validity of these results. How far would these results vary across different cultures? Any thoughts on that?
Okay, so the first thing I'm going to say is that we were interested specifically, right from the start when we were discussing our research agenda with people at FSDZ. The question was, what do husbands and wives do with little bits of spare cash? Yeah, because FSDZ is interesting in supporting people in their financial management, and in particular we were thinking about how do we encourage people to save. Okay, so this is all about what do husbands and wives do with little bits of spare cash, and of course we're giving them a little bit of spare cash in order to make a decision about what to do with a bit of spare cash. So in that regard, external validity of the kind of this is very abstract form doesn't loom as large as when, for example, we're thinking about whether people trust each other and we reduce it to a money game. Yeah. However, in terms of generalizability, I think that the only way to answer that question would be to conduct the same set of experiments in other countries. Yeah. So, so when it comes to our first two conclusions here, research questions in earlier slides, we are essentially seeking to see whether we can replicate findings that other people have from other countries in Zambia, and we replicate. But then moving on, introducing the normative components to the analysis is novel, and it would be interesting to do it in other countries. Hasn't been done yet.
Thank you. I know we're out of time. We have just one more question. Yeah. Hamna, if you would like to ask a question, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Barr. That was a really interesting talk. So I know that you've already talked about heterogeneity, and probably you guys haven't done too much on that. But one thought that I had was, do you think that the years since couples are married may have an impact on how different their personal normative beliefs are, the extent to which there is disagreement between the husband and the wife, and whether you have had any observations on that? And two, from what I understand, the study is based on financial allocation decisions. So the extent to which women are willing to hide money. And I just want you to get your thoughts on, do you think this can have implications for other sorts of behavior also, other than financial allocation decisions? And do you think that similar, has there been work done on non-financial decisions and the extent to which women are willing to hide, whether it's beliefs or whether that's deciding what to do for their children, etc.? So yeah, those are the questions that I have.
Okay, so all right, so the second part, I'm just going to say, I don't know. We'll have to work out what the research design would be to look at the look at that. And then I can't remember the first part. What was the first part? Heterogeneity. So as I said, we see subtle differences between the matrilineal and patrilineal members of the matrilineal, patrilineal ethnic groups. And to be perfectly honest with you, I can't remember exactly what they are at the moment. And they are subtle. So watch this space for
I think we've lost Abigail. All right, so while I still have you all captive and online, let me just very quickly introduce our next seminar as well. So I'm just going to wait till Abigail comes back and then we can continue. But in the meantime, please join us next week when we'll have Ali Hasnan. And he's going to be talking about automated aggregation of political violence data from Pakistan, which I'm sure is going to be very interesting. We'll be sharing links for registration very soon via email and our website. So please do keep track of when that is posted.